Evan was a talented watchmaker. His workshop in a small town was famous for being able to fix any watch, no matter its condition or age. But he was always looking for something special that would challenge him. One day, while walking through a market, he came across an antique stall full of old things. Among the many worn trinkets, his eye was caught by a massive clock. It was battered, with cracked glass and darkened bronze. The mechanism seemed to have stopped forever, but there was something mesmerizing about its design. "It's beautiful," Evan said, touching the case. The seller, an older man with a piercing gaze, frowned. "This clock is not meant to be fixed. It's best left alone." Evan laughed. "I've heard stories like this many times, but believe me, I know how to handle such things." The salesman stared at him for a long time, but still sold the watch. Before leaving, he said, "The watch hasn't stopped. It's waiting. Don't turn it on." Evan just shrugged, taking the find with him. In his workshop, he carefully examined the watch. Its case was covered in intricate carvings. Strange faces with empty eyes were visible among the images of leaves and flowers. The mechanism inside seemed more complex than anything he had seen before. Despite the antique dealer's warning, Evan couldn't resist. He began to fix it, hoping to see how the watch would work again. The lamp was far enough that he could see that the face was half in the direction it had been before. Evan set to work with enthusiasm. He took the clock apart, carefully examining each cog and gear. However, the deeper he delved into its mechanism, the more odd things he noticed. At first, it was a slight feeling as if someone was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, but the workshop was empty. On the second day of repairs, he was sitting at the workbench when he suddenly heard a soft ticking. Evan looked up, listening intently. It was impossible. The clock lay disassembled in front of him, each gear neatly laid out on the table. "Just tired," he muttered, trying to concentrate. But the ticking did not stop. It sounded closer and further away, like an echo filling the entire workshop. The next night, while working late, he noticed that the lights in the workshop had begun to flicker. The shadows of the tools that had been motionless began to move subtly, as if they had a life of their own. One day, as he was inserting a gear back into the mechanism, there was a flicker of movement in the corner of the room. Evan looked up and saw a long shadow slide along the wall. It moved smoothly, like liquid, unattached to a light source. "It's nerves," he told himself, but there was uncertainty in his voice. On the third day, he decided to stop and rest, but even at home, in bed, he could hear it, a steady, precise ticking that echoed in his head. In that moment, he realized that the clock did not want him to stop. When he returned to the workshop, the mechanism he had left disassembled was partially reassembled. The gears were in place, although he clearly remembered leaving them in disarray. The shadows were bolder now. They slid along the walls, sometimes stopping behind him. Once, he felt a cold breeze pass by, and in the reflection of the glass case of the clock, it seemed to him that someone tall and shapeless was standing behind his shoulder. But the most frightening thing was that the clock began to move on its own. Even with the missing parts, the hand slowly moved forward, making a booming, heavy ticking, as if counting down something important. On the fourth day of work, the clock looked almost complete. Evan installed the last gears and tightened the spring, hoping to see the mechanism come to life again. As soon as he put the cover back on, the hands began to move, with a soft click. The ticking became louder than before. It filled the entire room now, as if time itself could be heard. Evan felt a strange relief, as if he had completed something important. But the feeling did not last long. The lights in the workshop flickered sharply, and then went out. Evan froze as shadows began to creep out of the dark corners. They surrounded him, their forms indistinct, but their eyes, black and empty, looked straight at him. "You fixed it," came a voice, deep and booming, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. Evan jumped up, but his feet seemed rooted to the floor. His hands began to grow cold, and he felt something invisible pulling him toward the clock. "What is this?" he shouted, but his voice was caught in the heavy air. "Huh?" said Bernie. The clock he had fixed began to move faster. The hands spun at an incredible speed, the ticking merging into a hum like a heartbeat. The shadows began to merge into a single figure, tall and long, with bony hands reaching out to Evan. "You gave away your time," the voice boomed. "Now it belongs to us." Evan felt his body shrink, his strength leaving him. Every moment it felt like a piece of his life was being torn away and sent into the clock. He watched the hands slow down again, but with each movement, his face in the mirror of the case grew older. Wrinkles covered his skin, his hair turned gray, and his breathing became weak. When the clock stopped, Evan fell to his knees. His body was exhausted and his eyes were dull. The last thing he saw was his reflection in the glass, where someone else was in his place. "Go find your truth and walk in the fire." The clock was silent again, but now it was new, its case shining and its hands motionless, waiting for the next movement. The next day, the workshop was found empty. Only the antique cuckoo clock stood on the workbench, ready for its next owner.